The November fog rolled through Sacramento's midtown like a shroud, drawn slowly across a corpse, thick enough to muffle the footsteps of the social worker who stood frozen on the sidewalk at 1426 F Street on the morning of November 11th, 1988. The Victorian boarding house rose before her, its gingerbread trim painted a cheerful lavender that seemed obscene against the grey morning, and somewhere beneath the mist hung the unmistakable sweetness of decomposition. A smell the woman would later describe to investigators as heavy, like rotting fruit mixed with something else, something wrong. In her hand, she clutched a welfare check made out to Alvaro Montoya, a mentally disabled man who had been reported missing for 7 weeks, yet whose rent payments had continued to arrive at the county office with clockwork precision, signed in handwriting that didn't quite match his own. The landlady who answered the door that morning was a 60-year-old grandmother with silver hair pinned beneath a modest hat, wearing a lavender dress that matched her home's trim, her hands still damp from washing breakfast dishes, hands that had, police would later determine, buried 9 bodies in the very garden where roses now bloomed in defiant crimson splashes against the fog. Before we continue, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. The story of Dorothea Helen Puente does not begin at 1426 F Street, though it would certainly end there. To understand the woman who would become one of California's most prolific serial killers, one must travel backward through decades of reinvention, through a labyrinth of aliases and marriages and crimes that left a trail of victims stretching back further than anyone initially imagined. She was born Dorothea Helen Gray on January 9, 1929, in Redlands, California, a small city nestled in the shadow of the San Bernardino Mountains, where orange groves stretched toward the horizon and the scent of citrus hung heavy in the summer air. Her childhood was neither idyllic nor entirely tragic in the beginning. Her father, Jesse James Gray, worked as a cotton picker and laborer, moving the family through the agricultural valleys of California in search of work, while her mother, Trudy May, struggled with what neighbors would later describe as nervous episodes that left her bedridden for days at a time. The Depression had already tightened its grip on the nation when Dorothea was born, and by the time she reached school age, her family had fractured beyond repair. Her father died of tuberculosis in 1937, when Dorothea was just 8 years old. Her mother, already unstable, descended into a grief so profound that she could no longer care for her children. Trudy May died the following year, in 1938, leaving 9-year-old Dorothea and her siblings orphaned in a state that had little infrastructure for such casualties of poverty. The children were scattered, some to relatives, others to orphanages, still others to the informal foster system that existed in agricultural communities, where children could be placed with families who needed extra hands for fieldwork in exchange for room and board. Dorothea found herself in an orphanage in Los Angeles, a sprawling institution where children slept in rows of iron beds and learned early that survival depended on making oneself useful or invisible. She would later tell multiple contradictory stories about her childhood, that she had been raised by wealthy parents who gave her piano lessons and dressed her in silk, that she had grown up on a ranch with horses and cattle, that her family had been Mexican immigrants who spoke no English, that her mother had been a Swedish aristocrat fallen on hard times. The truth was simpler and harder. She was the daughter of poor, itinerant workers who had died young and left their children to the mercy of a system that had little mercy to spare. By 16, Dorothea had escaped the orphanage system through the oldest means available to young women of her era, marriage. In 1945, as World War II drew to its close and soldiers began returning home to California's ports, she married a young serviceman named Fred McFall. The marriage lasted only 2 years, producing 2 daughters whom Dorothea would abandon with relatives shortly after their births. McFall would later tell investigators that his young wife had been strange from the start. She lied constantly, invented elaborate stories about her background, and seemed incapable of maintaining any consistent version of her own history. More troubling, she showed no interest in their children, treating them with an indifference that bordered on hostility. When she left in 1948, taking nothing with her and leaving no forwarding address, McFall felt only relief. The next 2 decades of Dorothea's life exist in fragments, pieced together from court records, police reports, and the hazy memories of people who encountered her during her wanderings through California's Central Valley. She married again in 1952 to a man named Axel Johansson, a union that lasted less than 3 years and ended with accusations of forged checks and stolen property. She drifted through Stockton and Modesto, through Sacramento and San Francisco, working as a prostitute, a caregiver, a seamstress, a cook, whatever paid enough to keep her housed and clothed and fed. She developed a taste for alcohol that would dog her throughout her life, and she learned early that elderly people, particularly elderly men living alone on fixed incomes, represented a reliable source of income for a woman willing to provide companionship and care. Her first documented serious crime occurred in 1960, when she was arrested in Sacramento for running a brothel out of a boarding house on 9th Street. The operation was small-time by the standards of the era. A few women, a handful of regular clients. Discreet enough that it might have continued indefinitely had one of the girls not complained to police about being shortchanged. Dorothea served 90 days in county jail, a sentence that did little to deter her, but taught her valuable lessons about the importance of discretion and the need to cultivate relationships with the right people. Lawyers, social workers, police officers who might be inclined to look the other way. The 1960s saw Dorothea cycle through marriages and crimes with increasing frequency. In 1966, she married Roberto Puente, a Mexican national whose surname she would retain for the rest of her life, even after the marriage dissolved. Roberto would later describe her as charming but unstable, prone to fits of rage that seemed to come from nowhere, and obsessed with money in ways that made him uncomfortable. She forged checks in his name, ran up debts that followed him for years, and when he finally left, she simply moved on to the next mark. By the late 1960s, Dorothea had settled into a pattern that would define the next phase of her life. She operated boarding houses in Sacramento's downtown area, catering to elderly residents who received Social Security or disability checks that she could help them manage. The arrangement was mutually beneficial, at least on the surface. Her tenants received housing, meals, and companionship, while Dorothea received their trust and eventually access to their finances. She was a good cook, everyone agreed, and she kept a clean house. She attended church regularly, volunteered for local charities, and cultivated a reputation as a kind-hearted woman who took in society's forgotten souls. But beneath the surface, darker patterns were emerging. In 1978, she was convicted of forging 34 checks belonging to elderly tenants in her care, stealing more than $4,000, a significant sum in that era. The judge, swayed by her age, her apparent remorse, and her claims that she had been led astray by a manipulative boyfriend, sentenced her to 5 years probation and ordered her to pay restitution. She served no jail time. Within months, she was back in business, running another boarding house and cultivating new tenants whose finances she could exploit. The 1982 case should have stopped her. That spring, a 74-year-old Stockton businessman named Malcolm Mackenzie hired Dorothea as his live-in caregiver after meeting her through a mutual acquaintance. Mackenzie was recently widowed, lonely, and wealthy, exactly the sort of client Dorothea preferred. Within weeks, she had moved into his home, taken control of his medications, and begun systematically drugging him with doses of Dalmane, a powerful sedative mixed into his evening drinks. When Mackenzie woke in a daze to find Dorothea rifling through his safe, he managed to call police before collapsing. Officers found him barely conscious, with Dorothea claiming she had been helping him sleep because he suffered from insomnia. The Mackenzie case resulted in a conviction for theft and administering stupefying drugs to a victim, a felony that carried a sentence of 5 years in state prison. For the first time in her life, Dorothea faced serious consequences. She was transported to the California Institution for Women at Frontera, a medium security facility in San Bernardino County, where she spent 3 years learning what she would later describe as the most valuable lessons of my life. She charmed the guards, befriended the chaplain, and earned early release for good behavior in 1985. Upon her release, she was 56 years old, with a criminal record that should have made it impossible for her to operate any kind of care facility. California law explicitly prohibited convicted felons from running boarding houses for the elderly or disabled, and her parole conditions specifically barred her from handling the finances of anyone in her care. These restrictions would prove utterly meaningless. Within months of her release, Dorothea had rented the 2-story Victorian at 1426 F Street in Sacramento's Alkali Flat neighborhood, a historically working-class district where rents were cheap and oversight was minimal. She hired a contractor to build an ornate sign, a hand-painted placard that read, "Dorothea's Boardinghouse," in elegant script, and began taking in tenants. The house itself was a monument to faded Victorian grandeur, built in 1889 during Sacramento's late 19th century boom, when the city still imagined itself as a commercial rival to San Francisco. 3 stories tall, with a wraparound porch and ornate gingerbread trim, it had been converted to multi-family housing decades earlier and had passed through a succession of owners who had done little to maintain its original character. The neighborhood was equally worn. By the 1980s, Alkali Flat had become a zone of last resort for people whom society had discarded. Homeless shelters operated nearby. Methadone clinics served the area's substantial population of addicts. Social workers came and went with regularity, checking on clients who lived in the area's numerous boarding houses and single-room occupancy hotels. It was the perfect hunting ground for someone with Dorothea's particular skills. She cultivated relationships with social workers at the Volunteers of America, a charitable organization that placed homeless and mentally ill clients in local boarding houses. She volunteered at the nearby shelters, serving meals and chatting with residents about their situations. She attended meetings of the local social service agencies, presenting herself as a kind-hearted landlady who wanted to help the city's most vulnerable residents find stable housing. Her charm was legendary. Social workers described her as grandmotherly, caring, and dedicated. She remembered names, asked about families, brought homemade cookies to meetings. She wore modest dresses in soft colors, kept her gray hair neatly styled, and cultivated the appearance of a respectable elderly woman who had found her calling in service to others. The referrals began almost immediately. The Volunteers of America sent her Bert Montoya, a 51-year-old mentally disabled man who had lived on the streets for years and whose Social Security benefits made him an ideal tenant. They sent her James Gallup, a 57-year-old with a history of alcohol abuse who had recently completed a treatment program. They sent her Benjamin Fink, a 55-year-old transient who suffered from organic brain syndrome and needed structured housing. One by one, the agency filled her boarding house with vulnerable men and women whose checks arrived like clockwork each month, whose families had long since stopped looking for them, and whose disappearances would raise few questions in a city accustomed to its homeless population cycling in and out of visibility. Dorothea ran her house with an iron hand wrapped in velvet. Meals were served at precise times: breakfast at 7, lunch at noon, dinner at 6. Tenants who missed meals did not eat. Tenants who caused trouble were evicted immediately, their belongings deposited on the sidewalk without ceremony. She controlled access to medications, claiming that her tenants were too confused or irresponsible to manage their own prescriptions. She collected their benefit checks directly, claiming that she was helping them manage their finances. The tenants who survived her care would later describe an atmosphere of quiet menace. They knew something was wrong, but they were too marginalized, too poor, too lacking in alternatives to do anything about it. The first confirmed death occurred in early 1986, less than a year after Dorothea opened her boarding house. Leona Carpenter, a 75-year-old woman whom Dorothea had employed briefly as a cook, died under circumstances that should have prompted investigation, but somehow did not. The coroner listed natural causes, and Carpenter was buried in a county cemetery without autopsy. Dorothea attended the funeral, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief and telling mourners how much she would miss dear Leona. Everson Gilmouth followed in 1985 or 1986. The exact date was never established. Gilmouth was a 77-year-old retired truck driver from Oregon, whom Dorothea had met through a pen pal service while she was still incarcerated. Their correspondence had been romantic, filled with promises of marriage and a shared life once she was released. When Dorothea emerged from prison in 1985, Gilmouth drove from Oregon to Sacramento to meet her, bringing his possessions and his hopes for a new beginning. He was never seen alive again by anyone who knew him. What happened to Everson Gilmouth remained a mystery for years, but the physical evidence would eventually tell a grim story. Sometime in late 1985 or early 1986, Dorothea contracted with a handyman named Ismael Flores to help her with a project at her boarding house. She needed a large box built, she explained, something sturdy enough to hold books and documents that she planned to store. Flores constructed the box according to her specifications, never thinking to ask why a box intended for documents needed to be 6 feet long and nearly 3 feet wide. When the box was complete, Dorothea asked Flores to help her load it into his truck and dump it along the Sacramento River. He agreed, not thinking anything of it. She was an eccentric old lady, and the box was just full of old junk, wasn't it? The box floated in a slough near the river for weeks before a fisherman spotted it on New Year's Day 1986. Inside, officers found the body of an elderly man, so decomposed that identification was impossible. The corpse was transported to the county morgue, where it was assigned a case number, photographed, and eventually buried as a John Doe, when no one came forward to claim it. The homicide investigation went nowhere. There were no leads, no witnesses, no obvious connection to anyone in particular. The case went cold, filed away with hundreds of others that Sacramento's understaffed police department simply could not pursue. 3 years later, when detectives finally connected the body to Everson Gilmouth, they would discover that Dorothea had cashed his Social Security checks for months after his death, forging his signature on endorsements and depositing the money into her own accounts. She had even contacted his family in Oregon, posing as a friend of Everson's, to explain that he was doing well and didn't want to be disturbed. The family, estranged from Everson for years, accepted the explanation without question. The boarding house at 1426 F Street filled steadily throughout 1986 and 1987. Tenants came, tenants went, and if some of them seemed to disappear without explanation, well, that was the nature of life among Sacramento's homeless population. People drifted, relapsed, ended up in jail or the hospital, or simply decided to move on. Social workers checked in periodically, but their caseloads were enormous, their oversight minimal, and their trust in Dorothea complete. She was helpful after all. She cared about their clients. She kept detailed records and returned calls promptly. She was, in every visible way, a model landlady. What happened behind the closed doors of 1426 F Street remained hidden. The deaths accumulated in the shadows. Dorothy Miller, a 64-year-old who moved into the boarding house in 1987 and vanished within months. Benjamin Fink, the brain-damaged transient referred by Volunteers of America, who stopped appearing at his appointments with social workers and whose checks continued to arrive at Dorothea's address. Vera Faye Martin, a 64-year-old woman who had been referred by a local shelter and who simply ceased to exist one day in 1987. James Gallup, the recovering alcoholic, who told a friend he was doing great at his new place and was never heard from again. Dorothea's method was patient and methodical. She targeted people with few social connections, the mentally ill, the alcoholics, the elderly without family. She learned their medication routines, gained access to their prescriptions, and gradually increased their dosages to fatal levels. Some she smothered in their sleep. Others she simply drugged into unconsciousness and allowed to die of respiratory depression. The specific causes of death would never be determined for most of her victims. By the time their bodies were exhumed, decomposition had destroyed much of the evidence that might have revealed her methods. What remained was the disposal. Dorothea could not simply allow bodies to accumulate in her boarding house. The smell alone would have attracted attention. Instead, she recruited a series of handymen and day laborers to help with landscaping projects in her small backyard garden. She was an avid gardener, she explained, and she wanted to improve the property. The work involved digging deep trenches to plant fruit trees, she said, or to improve drainage. The workers dug, collected their pay, and went on their way, never suspecting what would be deposited in the holes they had excavated. Dorothea's favorite disposal site was a patch of ground beneath the window of her first-floor bedroom. The soil there was soft, easy to work, and largely invisible from the street. Over time, she planted roses and tulips and other flowering plants to disguise the disturbed earth. Her garden became locally famous. Neighbors marveled at how beautifully the flowers grew, how lush and healthy the plants appeared. One elderly man who lived next door later recalled that Dorothea had explained her gardening success by noting that good soil makes all the difference. By mid-1988, the boarding house held as many as 15 tenants at a time, packed into small rooms on the upper floors, while Dorothea maintained comfortable quarters on the ground level. The rent was reasonable, the meals were hot, and the rules were strictly enforced. Tenants who questioned Dorothea's authority found themselves evicted. Tenants who cooperated found a semblance of stability in a city that offered them few alternatives. And tenants who became inconvenient, those whose checks were too small, whose behaviors were too disruptive, whose continued existence served no useful purpose, simply disappeared. Alvaro Bert Montoya's arrival at the boarding house in 1988 would prove to be the beginning of the end. Bert was a 51-year-old man with significant developmental disabilities who had spent much of his life in institutional care. He was friendly, trusting, and utterly incapable of managing his own affairs. His social security check was substantial, more than enough to cover his rent and provide Dorothea with a healthy profit. He had been referred to the boarding house by a social worker named Judy Moyes, who worked for the Volunteers of America and who had developed a particular fondness for Bert during his time in their programs. Moyes visited him regularly at first, checking to ensure that he was being properly cared for, and Dorothea charmed her as she had charmed so many others. But in the late summer of 1988, Bert began to disappear. His absences were gradual at first. He missed an appointment in August, then another in early September. Moyes called the boarding house and spoke with Dorothea, who explained that Bert had been visiting family in Mexico or away on a trip with a friend. The explanations were plausible enough that Moyes accepted them without pushing further. But when September turned to October and Bert still had not reappeared, Moyes grew concerned. She knew Bert well enough to know that he did not have family in Mexico, that he did not take trips, that he was incapable of managing such activities on his own. Something was wrong. Moyes began investigating, and what she found was disturbing. Bert's social security checks continued to be cashed, the endorsements signed in handwriting that looked nothing like his own. His belongings remained at the boarding house, untouched. Other tenants claimed they had not seen him in weeks, though their accounts varied and several seemed confused about timelines. Most troubling of all, when Moise pressed Dorothea for specifics about Bert's whereabouts, the older woman's stories shifted and contradicted one another. First, Bert was in Mexico, then he was in Los Angeles. Then he had moved to a different facility. Then he had returned, but was resting and could not receive visitors. On November 7th, 1988, Moise filed a missing persons report with the Sacramento Police Department. The report landed on the desk of Detective John Cabrera, a veteran investigator with the department's homicide unit who had worked enough cases to recognize when something was seriously wrong. Moise's concerns were detailed and specific. She provided documentation of Bert's disability, copies of his benefits paperwork, and a timeline of his disappearance that suggested foul play. Cabrera decided to visit 1426 F Street personally. He arrived on November 11th, accompanied by Moise and several uniformed officers, to find Dorothea puttering in her garden despite the chill November morning. She was pleasant and cooperative, inviting the officers inside for coffee and answering their questions with apparent candor. Bert, she explained, had left the boarding house several weeks earlier to visit a nephew in Mexico. She had tried to convince him to stay, but he was determined to go. She had even driven him to the bus station herself. No, she did not have a phone number or address for this nephew. No, she had not heard from Bert since his departure. Yes, she was happy to help in any way she could. But as Dorothea spoke, Detective Cabrera found himself distracted by something outside the kitchen window, the garden. It was well maintained, lush with plants despite the season, and recently disturbed in several locations. Mounded patches of earth rose at intervals throughout the small yard, as if someone had been digging and filling holes. And beneath the coffee and the breakfast smells that filled the house, Cabrera detected something else, a faint but unmistakable sweetness that he recognized from crime scenes past. The smell of decomposition. Cabrera excused himself and walked into the backyard, leaving Dorothea mid-sentence in the kitchen. He stood for a long moment among the roses and the tulips, breathing deeply, trying to isolate the source of the odor. It seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once, rising from the soil itself, as if the ground were exhaling. He knelt beside one of the mounded patches and pressed his fingers into the earth. It was soft, recently turned, and beneath the surface, perhaps 18 inches down, his fingers encountered something that was not soil, not root, not stone, something yielding. Cabrera withdrew his hand and returned to the house. He informed Dorothea that he would be obtaining a warrant to search the premises, and he assigned officers to remain on scene until the paperwork could be completed. Dorothea accepted this information with equanimity, offering the officers more coffee and remarking that she had nothing to hide. She was certain, she said, that the investigation would clear up whatever misunderstanding had occurred. The first body was exhumed on November 12, 1988. The excavation team worked carefully, using hand tools to avoid disturbing evidence, and within hours they had uncovered human remains buried approximately 3 feet beneath the surface of Dorothea's rose garden. The body was wrapped in cloth and plastic, badly decomposed, and missing its head, hands, and feet. A dismemberment pattern that suggested an effort to prevent identification. The remains were transported to the county morgue while officers continued to dig. By nightfall, they had found a second body, then a third. The media descended on F Street like locusts, their cameras and microphones overwhelming the police tape and the uniformed officers who struggled to maintain order. Neighbors emerged from their homes to watch the spectacle, some crying, others simply staring in disbelief. The boarding house had stood in their midst for years. Its landlady, a familiar figure who waved from her porch and chatted over the fence about gardening and recipes and the weather. Now the garden itself had become a graveyard, and the grandmother with the lavender dress had become a monster. But Dorothea Puente was no longer there to witness the spectacle. On the morning of November 12th, as officers prepared to execute the search warrant, Dorothea had approached Detective Cabrera with a simple request. She needed to buy a cup of coffee at the hotel across the street, she explained. The process of watching officers dig up her garden was upsetting, and she needed a moment to compose herself. Cabrera, inexplicably, agreed. He watched as the elderly woman in her lavender dress walked slowly across the street, entered the Clarion Hotel, and disappeared. She never returned. The coffee break became the most infamous mistake in Sacramento Police Department history. Cabrera would spend years defending his decision, arguing that he had no reason at that point to believe Dorothea was a flight risk. She was a 60-year-old woman with no history of violence, and the investigation had not yet revealed the full scope of her crimes. But his colleagues were less forgiving. An elderly woman had walked away from a crime scene that would eventually yield 9 bodies, and she had done so with the explicit permission of the lead investigator. Dorothea fled south, taking a Greyhound bus to Los Angeles and checking into the Royal Viking Motel under the name Dorothy Johansson, an alias borrowed from one of her former husbands. She spent her first hours of freedom in a bar called the Monte Carlo Warno, drinking vodka and telling the other patrons that she was a recently widowed grandmother looking for companionship. A retired carpenter named Charles Wilguez struck up a conversation, and by the end of the evening, he had invited her to dinner the following night. Meanwhile, Sacramento was in chaos. The body count at 1426 F Street continued to rise. 4 bodies, then 5, then 6. The medical examiner's office was overwhelmed, and investigators scrambled to identify remains that had been buried for months or years. Television crews broadcast live updates from the scene, their cameras capturing the methodical excavation of what had become California's most notorious crime scene. And across the nation, Dorothea's face appeared on newspaper front pages and television screens, always the same photograph. A smiling grandmother in a lavender dress, looking for all the world like someone's beloved aunt. Charles Wilguez saw that photograph in a newspaper on November 16, 1988, 4 days after Dorothea's escape. He was sitting in the Monte Carlo Wumpf, nursing a drink and waiting for his new lady friend to arrive, when he glanced at the paper left behind by another patron and felt his blood run cold. The woman in the photograph was unmistakably Dorothy Johansson, the sweet widow he had been courting for the past several days. The headline above the photograph read, "Boardinghouse Killer Sought in Sacramento." Wilguez did not confront Dorothea when she arrived. Instead, he made small talk, bought her a drink, and excused himself to use the restroom. From the bar's payphone, he called the Los Angeles Police Department and reported what he knew. Officers arrived within the hour, entering the Monte Carlo firm to find Dorothea Puente sitting calmly at the bar, sipping vodka and insisting that there had been some kind of mistake. She was arrested without incident and transported to county jail to await extradition to Sacramento. Her booking photograph shows a woman who looks far older than her 59 years, gray-haired, heavy-faced, wearing an expression of weary resignation that might almost be mistaken for defeat. But Dorothea Puente was not defeated. She was calculating. Even as the evidence mounted against her, she was already constructing the defense that she would maintain for the rest of her life. She had never killed anyone. The trial would not begin for more than 4 years. California's criminal justice system moved slowly in the late 1980s and early 1990s, and the Puente case presented particular challenges. The victims had to be identified, a process complicated by decomposition, dismemberment, and the fact that many of them had been estranged from family for years. The causes of death had to be determined, which proved largely impossible given the condition of the remains. The prosecution had to establish a pattern of criminal conduct stretching back decades, which required investigators to track down witnesses and documents from across the state. The identification process was heartbreaking in its specificity. The first body recovered, the headless, handless corpse found beneath Dorothea's roses, was eventually identified as Leona Carpenter, the elderly cook who had worked briefly for Dorothea in 1986. The identification was made through dental records, one of the few reliable methods available given the state of decomposition. Carpenter had been 75 years old at the time of her death, a widow with no living children, known primarily through records at the Social Security Administration and the County Health Department. She had worked for Dorothea for only a few weeks before dying suddenly of what the coroner had originally ruled natural causes. Her body had been buried without autopsy, but when investigators exhumed her original grave, they found it empty. Dorothea had apparently moved the body at some point, reburying it in her garden to prevent discovery. The second body was identified as Dorothy Miller, a 64-year-old former resident of the Boardinghouse who had been reported missing by a nephew in late 1987. Miller had suffered from chronic alcoholism and had spent years cycling through shelters and treatment programs before landing at Dorothea's door. Her nephew had last spoken with her by telephone in August 1987. She had sounded confused and sleepy, he recalled, and had mentioned that her landlady was taking good care of her. He never heard from her again. When he called the boarding house to check on her, Dorothea explained that Dorothy had moved to a different facility and provided no forwarding information. Benjamin Fink was the third victim identified, the brain-damaged transient who had been referred to Dorothea by the Volunteers of America. Fink had been 55 years old, a former laborer whose cognitive decline had left him incapable of independent living. His Social Security checks had continued to arrive at 1426 F Street for months after his disappearance, each one endorsed in handwriting that bore no resemblance to his own. Investigators eventually determined that Dorothea had forged more than $15, as there were zero in benefits payments belonging to Fink alone. James Gallup, the recovering alcoholic, was identified through fingerprint records maintained by the California Department of Corrections. He had served time for minor offenses in the 1970s. Gallup had been 57 years old, recently sober, and eager to rebuild his life when he moved into Dorothea's boarding house in early 1988. His sister would later testify that he had called her from the boarding house, sounding hopeful about his prospects, and had promised to visit for the upcoming holidays. He never arrived. Vera Faye Martin, 64, was identified through dental records provided by a dentist in Los Angeles, where she had received treatment years earlier. Martin had been homeless for much of the 1980s, drifting between shelters and boarding houses throughout California, estranged from family who had long since stopped searching for her. Her body was among the most deteriorated, suggesting that she had been one of Dorothea's earliest victims at F Street. Betty Palmer was 64, a schizophrenic woman who had been referred to the boarding house by Sacramento County Mental Health Services. Palmer's delusions had made her difficult to place, and social workers had been relieved when Dorothea agreed to take her in. Her benefits checks, nearly $800 per month in Social Security disability payments, had continued to be cashed for more than a year after her death. The final three victims identified from the F Street excavation were Alvaro Bert Montoya, whose disappearance had triggered the investigation. His remains were found in the garden's northeast corner, still wearing the remnants of the clothing he had been last seen in. Beside him lay the body of an unidentified woman who was never successfully connected to any missing persons report. She remains a Jane Doe to this day, one of thousands of unknown victims buried in California's Potter's Fields. And in the deepest grave, beneath a particularly lush patch of roses, investigators found the remains of Everson Gilmouth, the pen pal from Oregon whose body had been found floating in the Sacramento River 3 years earlier. Dental records confirmed the identification, proving that Dorothea had moved his body from the river site to her garden at some point. A chilling demonstration of her willingness to return to her crimes. The total count: 9 bodies in the garden, 1 body in the river, and at least 2 other deaths that investigators believe Dorothea was responsible for, but could not prove. She had killed at least 11 people over a period of approximately 3 years, and her motive in every case was the same: money. The victims had been worth more dead than alive. Their benefit checks continued to arrive for months after their deaths, providing Dorothea with a steady income stream that she used to maintain her comfortable lifestyle, purchase new clothes and furnishings, and fund her gambling habit at local card rooms. The trial began on February 22, 1993, more than 4 years after Dorothea's arrest, in the Monterey County Superior Court. The case had been moved from Sacramento due to extensive pretrial publicity. The prosecution, led by Deputy District Attorney John O'Mara, faced a significant challenge. They had bodies, but they did not have clear causes of death. Decomposition had destroyed much of the physical evidence that might have proven murder, and toxicology testing had yielded ambiguous results. The victims had all been elderly, ill, or addicted to substances that might have contributed to their deaths. How could the prosecution prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Dorothea had killed them, rather than simply burying them after they died of natural causes? The answer lay in the pattern. O'Mara constructed his case around what he called a constellation of circumstances that, taken together, could only point to murder. He showed the jury that every victim had been seen alive within days of their disappearance, and that none had shown signs of terminal illness. He demonstrated that Dorothea had continued to cash their benefit checks for months after their deaths, forging their signatures with increasing boldness. He presented evidence that she had lied consistently and elaborately to social workers, family members, and police about the whereabouts of her tenants. And he called expert witnesses who testified that the pattern of deaths in Dorothea's care, multiple victims, all elderly or disabled, all dying within a short period, all buried in her garden, was statistically impossible unless foul play was involved. The defense, led by attorney Kevin Climo, offered an alternative theory. Dorothea was a fraud, not a murderer. She had stolen from her tenants, certainly, and she had buried their bodies to conceal her crimes. But the deaths themselves had been natural. Her tenants were sick, elderly people who had died in her care, and she had panicked and buried them rather than face questions about their deaths. It was wrong, Climo acknowledged, but it was not murder. The prosecution could not prove that Dorothea had administered fatal doses of anything, could not prove that she had smothered anyone, could not prove anything beyond the undeniable fact that she had disposed of bodies and stolen money. Dorothea herself took the stand, a decision that surprised many observers. She was calm, articulate, and absolutely unwavering in her denial of murder. She had found the bodies, she testified. Her tenants had died in their sleep of natural causes, and she had buried them because she was afraid of losing her license and being sent back to prison. She had been scared, she said. She had made bad decisions, but she had never harmed anyone. The jury deliberated for 24 days, one of the longest deliberations in California history, before returning with verdicts. They convicted Dorothea of 3 counts of first-degree murder: Dorothy Miller, Benjamin Fink, and Vera Faye Martin. On the remaining 6 counts, they were unable to reach a unanimous verdict, and the judge declared a mistrial. The sentencing phase that followed was a battle over Dorothea's life. California law required the jury to weigh aggravating and mitigating factors in determining whether Dorothea should be executed or sentenced to life in prison. The prosecution argued for death, citing the vulnerability of her victims, the calculated nature of her crimes, and the utter lack of remorse she had displayed throughout the trial. The defense presented evidence of Dorothea's traumatic childhood, her history of mental illness, and her advanced age. She was now 64 years old and would likely die in prison regardless of the sentence imposed. In the end, the jury chose life. Dorothea Puente was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. a decision that satisfied neither the prosecution nor the families of her victims. She was transported to the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla, a maximum security prison in the San Joaquin Valley, where she would spend the rest of her days. But the story of 1426 F Street did not end with the trial. The boarding house itself became a macabre tourist attraction, drawing visitors from across the country who wanted to see the garden where Dorothea had buried her victims. The new owners initially tried to maintain the property as a normal residence, but the constant stream of gawkers made normal life impossible. Eventually, they gave up and moved away, leaving the house to cycle through a series of owners who struggled to overcome its grim reputation. The garden was replanted multiple times, but the roses never grew quite as well as they had under Dorothea's care. The families of the victims filed civil suits against Sacramento County and the Volunteers of America, alleging that both entities had failed in their duty to protect vulnerable people from a known predator. The suits were largely unsuccessful. Courts ruled that the social workers who had referred clients to Dorothea's care had no way of knowing about her violent tendencies, and that her previous convictions for fraud had not suggested that she was capable of murder. But the cases highlighted systemic failures in California's oversight of boarding houses and care facilities, leading to reforms that would tighten regulations in subsequent decades. Judy Moyes, the social worker whose persistence had led to Dorothea's arrest, left her position at Volunteers of America shortly after the trial. She had carried enormous guilt over the clients she had placed in Dorothea's care. Good people, vulnerable people. People who had trusted her to find them safe housing. She had done everything she could to help them, and they had died because of her recommendation. The weight of that knowledge proved impossible to bear. Detective John Cabrera retired from the Sacramento Police Department in 1995, never fully escaping the shadow of the coffee break that had allowed Dorothea to escape. He maintained until his death that he had made a reasonable decision based on the information available to him at the time, and that the intense criticism he faced was unjust. But he also acknowledged that the moment would define his career, regardless of anything else he had accomplished, and Dorothea herself adapted to prison life with characteristic resilience. She became something of a celebrity at Chowchilla, known for her cooking skills and her willingness to mentor younger inmates. She gave interviews to journalists and filmmakers, always maintaining her innocence, always insisting that she had been wrongly convicted. She published a cookbook, Cooking with a Serial Killer, co-authored with a true crime writer who had befriended her, featuring recipes from her boarding house days. The book sold well, its profits going to a victims' rights organization after the families of her victims objected to her profiting from her crimes. In 2011, Dorothea Puente died of natural causes at the California Institution for Women. She was 82 years old and had spent the final 18 years of her life behind bars. She never admitted to murdering anyone. Her death closed the chapter on one of California's most disturbing serial murder cases, but it did not provide closure for the families of her victims, many of whom were buried in unmarked graves in Sacramento's Potter's Field. The Jane Doe found in Dorothea's garden was never identified, her real name lost to history along with whatever family might have mourned her. The systemic failures that allowed Dorothea to prey on vulnerable people for decades have never been fully addressed. California's boarding house industry remains poorly regulated, and social workers continue to carry caseloads that make adequate oversight nearly impossible. The house at 1426 F Street still stands in Sacramento's Alkali Flat neighborhood, its Victorian trim freshly painted, its garden neat and unremarkable. New owners have come and gone, each trying to escape the property's history, each eventually surrendering to the reality that some addresses carry a weight that cannot be lifted. The neighbors rarely speak of what happened there, though occasionally a visitor will stop on the sidewalk and stare at the house, trying to reconcile its cheerful appearance with the horrors that unfolded within. The roses still bloom in the garden each spring. They are ordinary roses now, planted by people who wanted nothing more than to make the space beautiful again. But there are those who insist that the soil remembers what was buried there, that the ground itself bears witness to the crimes that were committed, holding the memory of 9 lives cut short by a grandmother in a lavender dress who served hot meals and maintained a clean house and killed for profit. The story of Dorothea Puente is, at its core, a story about invisibility. Her victims were invisible. Homeless, mentally ill, addicted, elderly, estranged from families who had given up on them. They existed in the margins of society, their presence noted primarily by social workers who were stretched too thin to provide meaningful oversight. When they disappeared, few noticed. When they died, fewer mourned. They were the forgotten people, and Dorothea understood their vulnerability better than anyone. She was invisible too, in her own way. An elderly woman running a boarding house in a working-class neighborhood. Who would suspect her of anything? She traded on stereotypes, presenting herself as a grandmother figure, a caretaker, a kind soul who had dedicated her life to helping society's outcasts. The very traits that should have raised suspicion, her excessive interest in her tenants' finances, her reluctance to allow visitors, her ever-shifting stories about where former tenants had gone, were dismissed because they came wrapped in lavender dresses and offers of coffee and cookies. The social workers who referred clients to her care were not negligent. They were overwhelmed. They carried caseloads that made individual attention impossible, and they relied on boarding house operators to provide the day-to-day supervision that the system could not offer. When Dorothea presented herself as a caring landlady, they wanted to believe her. They needed to believe her, because the alternative, that the system was funneling vulnerable people into the hands of a predator, was too terrible to contemplate. And so the bodies accumulated, one after another, buried in a garden that bloomed with suspicious vigor, while social workers made their check-in calls and Dorothea assured them that everything was fine. The fog that shrouded Sacramento on the morning of November 11th, 1988, has become a permanent feature of the story, a metaphor for the willful blindness that allowed Dorothea's crimes to continue for so long. The city was looking, but it was not seeing. The signs were there, but they were obscured by assumptions about what kind of person commits serial murder, about who is dangerous and who is trustworthy, about which lives matter enough to protect. The case changed how California approached the care of vulnerable populations, at least for a time. Boarding houses faced increased scrutiny. Background check requirements were tightened. Social workers received additional training on identifying potential exploitation. But memories are short, and bureaucracies are stubborn, and the fundamental dynamics that allowed Dorothea to operate, the invisibility of her victims, the overwhelmed social service system, the assumptions that elderly women are harmless, remain largely unchanged. There will be other Dorothea Puentes. Perhaps there already are. The boarding house at 1426 F Street stands as a monument to what happens when a society looks away from its most vulnerable members, when it consigns them to the margins and trusts that someone else will take care of them. Dorothea Puente did take care of them, in her own terrible way. She provided housing and meals, and an end that no one noticed until it was far too late. The garden still grows there, green and ordinary and full of secrets that the soil will never fully release. And somewhere in the potter's fields of Sacramento, the victims rest in unmarked graves, their names recorded only in court documents and newspaper archives, their lives reduced to entries in a case file that grows yellowed with age. They deserved better. They all deserved better. But the truth that Dorothea Puente buried in her garden was not just the truth of individual murders. It was the truth about who our society chooses to see and who it chooses to ignore, who receives protection and who is left to fend for themselves in a world that would rather not know what happens to people who fall through the cracks. That truth remains buried still, in gardens and institutions and policy decisions across California and beyond. Dorothea Puente is gone, but the conditions that allowed her to kill continue to exist. The invisible people are still invisible. The social workers are still overwhelmed. The boarding houses are still poorly regulated. And somewhere, in a house that looks perfectly ordinary from the street, someone is serving hot meals and cashing checks and waiting for another vulnerable person to walk through the door. The fog never fully lifts in Sacramento. There are always shadows where things can hide, places where the light does not reach, spaces where monsters can operate in plain sight. Dorothea Puente understood this better than most. She thrived in those spaces, building a life and a legacy on the bodies of people whom society had already abandoned. The boarding house where she buried the truth still stands. The garden still grows. And the questions she left behind, about guilt and responsibility and the cost of looking away, remain as urgent and as unanswerable as they were on that fog-shrouded morning when a social worker stood on the sidewalk and smelled something wrong rising from the roses. 9 bodies. 1 grandmother. A garden that bloomed too beautifully to be believed. The truth was there all along, buried just beneath the surface, waiting for someone to look down and dig. The aftermath of Dorothea Puente's crimes rippled through Sacramento's social service community for years, exposing fault lines that had existed long before she claimed her first victim. In the months following the exhumation of the bodies from 1426 F Street, the California state legislature convened hearings to examine how a convicted felon had been permitted to operate a boarding house serving vulnerable adults. The testimony was damning. Agency after agency admitted that they had failed to conduct adequate background checks, that they had relied on informal networks of referral rather than systematic oversight, that they had treated boarding house operators as partners rather than as potential threats. The Volunteers of America came under particular scrutiny. The organization had referred multiple clients to Dorothea's care, continuing to do so even after receiving reports that some of those clients had vanished under suspicious circumstances. Internal memos revealed that case managers had expressed concerns about the high turnover at 1426 F Street, but those concerns had never been escalated to supervisors or reported to licensing authorities. The organization's leadership apologized publicly and pledged reforms. But for the families of the victims, apologies came too late. Sacramento County's Adult Protective Services Division faced similar criticism. The agency was responsible for investigating reports of abuse and neglect involving vulnerable adults. But it was chronically understaffed and underfunded, with caseloads that exceeded national recommendations by factors of 2 or 3. Social workers testified that they had been aware of problems at Dorothea's boarding house. Unexplained disappearances, rumors of financial exploitation, the persistent smell that neighbors sometimes reported, but they had lacked the resources to conduct thorough investigations. By the time the bodies were discovered, it was already far too late. The reforms that followed were significant, but incomplete. California enacted legislation requiring enhanced background checks for boarding house operators, including fingerprint screening and reviews of criminal records from other states. The state created new licensing categories for residential care facilities, with stricter oversight requirements and regular inspections by trained investigators. Social workers received additional training on identifying the signs of exploitation and abuse, and caseload standards were reduced, at least temporarily, to allow for more intensive monitoring of high-risk clients. But the fundamental problem remained. The population that Dorothea had targeted, elderly, disabled, mentally ill adults with few social connections and limited resources, continued to fall through the cracks. Boarding houses remained a critical part of California's housing infrastructure for these populations, and the operators of those facilities continued to wield enormous power over the lives of their tenants. The state simply did not have the resources to monitor every facility, to check on every resident, to ensure that every check was being cashed by the person it belonged to. And so the invisible people remained invisible, their welfare dependent on the goodwill of strangers who might or might not have their best interests at heart. The house at 1426 F Street passed through several owners in the years following Dorothea's arrest. The first purchaser, a real estate investor who bought the property at auction for far below market value, attempted to convert it into apartments, but was stymied by the constant stream of curiosity seekers who interrupted construction and unnerved potential tenants. He sold within 2 years, taking a significant loss, and the property sat vacant for nearly a decade, its windows boarded and its garden overgrown with weeds that concealed whatever remained of Dorothea's careful landscaping. In 2003, a Sacramento-based developer purchased the property with plans to demolish the Victorian structure and build modern townhouses on the lot. The plan drew immediate opposition from preservationists who argued that the house, despite its grim history, was an important example of late 19th century residential architecture. The fight lasted months, with public hearings and newspaper editorials and heated debates about whether preserving a murder house was an appropriate use of historic preservation laws. In the end, the preservationists won. The house was designated a local historic landmark, ensuring that its basic structure would be maintained regardless of future ownership. The developer sold the property to a private owner who undertook extensive renovations, restoring the Victorian trim and repainting the exterior in muted earth tones that bore no resemblance to the lavender that Dorothea had favored. The garden was completely replanted, with new soil brought in to replace the contaminated ground, a symbolic gesture that acknowledged the impossibility of truly purifying a space that had served as a mass grave. The new owner, a young professional who claimed not to be bothered by the property's history, lived there for several years before moving away for reasons that were never publicly disclosed. Today, the house at 1426 F Street is privately owned and occupied, its appearance unremarkable among the other Victorians that line the block. Tourists occasionally stop to photograph it, their knowledge of its history gleaned from true crime documentaries and Wikipedia articles, but there is little to distinguish it from any other house in the neighborhood. The garden is neat, but ordinary. Its plants healthy, but not unusually so. Its soil revealing nothing of what lies beneath. The neighborhood itself has changed dramatically since Dorothea's time. Alkali Flat, once a haven for boarding houses and single-room occupancy hotels, has undergone significant gentrification. The shelters and methadone clinics have mostly closed or relocated to other parts of the city. Young professionals and families have moved in, drawn by the neighborhood's proximity to downtown and its stock of affordable Victorian homes. The social service agencies that once dominated the area have been replaced by coffee shops and boutiques and upscale restaurants. The transformation has been celebrated by city officials and real estate developers, but it has come at a cost. The vulnerable populations that once found housing in Alkali Flat have been displaced to other neighborhoods, other cities, other states. Their invisibility made even more complete by their removal from urban cores where they might at least be seen by passers-by. The problems that allowed Dorothea Puente to prey on the elderly and disabled have not been solved. They have simply been relocated, pushed to the margins where they can be more easily ignored. The story of Dorothea Puente has been told and retold in countless forms since her arrest. Books, documentaries, television movies, and true crime podcasts have examined every aspect of the case, from the childhood trauma that may have shaped her psychology to the systemic failures that allowed her crimes to continue for so long. She has become a figure of enduring fascination, one of the rare female serial killers in American history. A grandmother who murdered for profit and buried her victims beneath the flowers she tended with such care. But for all the attention her case has received, certain questions remain unanswered. How many people did Dorothea Puente actually kill? The 9 bodies recovered from her garden represent the confirmed count, but investigators have long suspected that the true number is higher. Her criminal history stretches back decades, through multiple cities and multiple aliases, and the populations she targeted were precisely those whose disappearances would raise the fewest questions. Elderly tenants, homeless transients, mentally ill adults without family connections, any of them could vanish without triggering investigation, their absence attributed to the natural flux of life among society's forgotten people. The 1982 case involving Malcolm Mackenzie suggests that Dorothea was already experimenting with drugging victims years before she opened the Boardinghouse on F Street. The 1978 forgery conviction suggests that she had been exploiting elderly tenants for even longer than that. How many of those victims died under suspicious circumstances? How many were buried in gardens or dumped in rivers, or disposed of by methods that investigators never uncovered? The records from that era are incomplete, the witnesses long dead or scattered, the evidence destroyed by time and decay. The Jane Doe found in Dorothea's garden haunts the case to this day. She was a woman of indeterminate age, probably between 40 and 60 years old, whose body showed signs of the same dismemberment pattern used on several other victims. But despite decades of investigation, her identity has never been established. No missing persons report matched her description. No family member ever came forward to claim her. She died anonymous and was buried anonymous. Her existence erased so completely that not even her name survived. Somewhere, presumably, there is someone who knew her, a family member, a friend, a former neighbor who might recognize a photograph or a description, but that person has never materialized. The Jane Doe remains what she was when she was found, a symbol of the invisibility that allowed Dorothea's crimes to flourish, a reminder that there are people whose lives and deaths pass entirely unnoticed by a world that has chosen not to see them. Dorothea Puente herself never provided answers to these questions. Throughout her trial and her years in prison, she maintained absolute denial of any wrongdoing, insisting that her tenants had died of natural causes and that she had merely panicked and buried them to avoid scrutiny. She expressed no remorse for her crimes, offered no insight into her motives, provided no information that might have helped investigators identify additional victims or locate remaining remains. She went to her grave in 2011 with whatever secrets she still possessed, taking with her any hope of complete resolution. The families of her victims have had to make peace with uncertainty. Most of them had long been estranged from the people who died at 1426 F Street. That estrangement was, in fact, a key factor in why those individuals had become vulnerable to exploitation in the first place. For these families, the discovery of their loved ones' remains brought not only grief, but guilt. The recognition that they might have prevented tragedy if they had maintained closer contact, if they had checked more frequently, if they had not allowed the bonds of relationship to fray. The sister of James Gallup, the recovering alcoholic who had called her with such hope before his death, testified at Dorothea's trial about the pain of learning what had happened. She had assumed that James had relapsed, had returned to the streets, had disappeared into the anonymous mass of homeless people who drifted through California's cities. She had not searched for him because she believed that searching was futile, that he would resurface when he was ready, that some people simply could not be helped. Learning that he had been murdered, that he had been killed precisely because he was vulnerable and alone, was a wound that would never fully heal. Similar stories echoed through the trial. The nephew of Dorothy Miller, who had assumed his aunt had simply moved away without leaving contact information. The distant relatives of Benjamin Fink, who had not known he existed until police contacted them about identifying remains. The social workers who had referred clients to Dorothea's care, believing they were providing stable housing, only to discover that they had sent vulnerable people to their deaths. The weight of collective guilt was almost as overwhelming as the crimes themselves. The case also raised troubling questions about the nature of serial murder and the assumptions that law enforcement brings to such investigations. Dorothea Puente did not fit the profile that criminologists had developed for serial killers. She was female, elderly, and ostensibly motivated by financial gain rather than sexual compulsion or power fantasy. Her crimes were not the ritualistic murders of a Ted Bundy or a Jeffrey Dahmer. They were practical, almost businesslike, conducted with an eye toward maximum profit and minimum risk. This profile confused investigators and contributed to the delay in her apprehension. When social workers reported concerns about the boarding house on F Street, police initially treated the reports as low-priority matters involving potential fraud rather than potential homicide. The fact that the victims were elderly and disabled, populations with high natural mortality rates, made it easy to dismiss suspicious deaths as merely unfortunate coincidences. Even when the bodies began to be discovered, some investigators struggled to accept that a grandmother in a lavender dress could be responsible for such atrocities. The case forced a re-evaluation of assumptions about who is capable of serial murder. Subsequent research has identified patterns of female serial killing that differ significantly from male patterns. Women are more likely to kill for profit, more likely to target vulnerable populations, more likely to use poison or suffocation rather than physical violence, and more likely to operate over extended periods without detection. Dorothea Puente became a case study in this emerging understanding, her crimes analyzed by criminologists, seeking to understand how gender shapes both the commission and the investigation of serial murder. But for all the academic analysis her case has generated, the human dimensions of the tragedy remain paramount. 9 people died at 1426 F Street. 9 people with names and histories and families who mourned them, however belatedly. They were not merely victims of a serial killer, they were victims of a society that had failed to protect them, that had consigned them to the margins and trusted that someone else would keep them safe. Leona Carpenter had worked as a cook, had married and divorced, had lived a life of quiet routine before circumstances led her to Dorothea's door. Dorothy Miller had struggled with alcoholism, but had also been a sister, a aunt, a friend to people who cared about her despite her struggles. Benjamin Fink had suffered brain damage that robbed him of his independence, but not his humanity, his need for connection and safety and belonging. James Gallup had fought his way back from addiction only to be murdered on the threshold of recovery. Each victim was a person, not merely a case number, and their deaths deserve to be remembered not as statistics, but as individual tragedies. The boarding house at 1426 F Street still stands in Sacramento's Alkali Flat neighborhood. The Victorian architecture has been lovingly restored, the garden is neat and well-maintained, and there is little visible evidence of the horrors that once occurred there. But for those who know the history, the house remains a monument to what can happen when a society looks away, when it consigns its most vulnerable members to the care of strangers and trusts that good intentions will prevail over darker impulses. The fog still rolls through Sacramento on November mornings, thick and cold and smelling faintly of the river. It shrouds the streets of Alkali Flat, just as it did on the morning when investigators first began to dig in Dorothea's garden, and it will continue to shroud them long after the last person who remembers the case has passed away. Some truths, once buried, can never be fully exhumed. Some questions can never be answered, and some crimes leave scars that no amount of renovation or redevelopment can erase. The story of Dorothea Puente is finished. The victims are at rest. The killer is dead. The house has been reclaimed by new owners who have no connection to its past. But the larger story, the story of invisible people and overworked social workers and a society that would rather not see the suffering in its midst, continues to unfold every day, in every city, in boarding houses and care facilities and single-room occupancy hotels where vulnerable people are at the mercy of those who control their lives. That is the truth that Dorothea Puente buried in her garden. It is the truth that we continue to bury every day in 1,000 small decisions to look away. The roses still bloom at 1426 F Street, red and beautiful against the weathered boards of the old Victorian. They grow in soil that has been replaced and replanted, in a garden that bears no visible trace of what it once contained. But soil has a memory, and houses have souls, and some places carry the weight of their history, no matter how thoroughly they are cleansed. On quiet nights, when the fog rolls in and the streets fall silent, neighbors sometimes claim to smell something beneath the cold moisture, a sweetness that should not be there, rising from a garden that has been purified and replanted and purified again. They dismiss it as imagination, as memory, as the power of suggestion acting on minds that know too much about what happened there. But the smell persists, faint and unmistakable, a reminder that some truths, once buried, refuse to stay underground.